It's the 28th of April, 2010, and Inter Milan are inside the Camp Nou. Barcelona's Camp Nou, Pep Guardiola's Camp Nou, the most dominant football team on the planet, playing the most beautiful attacking football anyone has seen in a generation, in front of 96,000 people who have come to watch their team finish the job in a Champions League semi-final.
From me, Clive Tilsley, and 96,000 others.
Mourinho's Inter sit deep, absurdly deep. 10 men behind the ball, sometimes all 11, packed into a defensive shape so compact and so deliberately ugly that the Spanish press will spend the next week calling it a crime against football. Barcelona have 76% possession. They complete over 700 passes. They look like the better team in every single metric that football has ever invented to measure quality. Inter win 3-1 on aggregate. Mourinho sprints across the Camp Nou pitch with his finger in the air. Inter have done it. Mourinho has done it. The impossible.
Inter Milan will go to Madrid. And José Mourinho's moment has come again.
This is not an accident. This is not a lucky result from a limited manager who got fortunate with the draw. This is the controlled destruction of the most talented squad in modern football by a man who understood something about competition that his opponent refused to accept. In approximately 500 BC, a Chinese military strategist named Sun Tzu wrote a text called The Art of War. It was a thin book. 13 chapters, roughly 6,000 words in its original form, and yet it became arguably the most influential treatise on conflict ever produced by a human mind. Generals studied it, emperors built dynasties around its principles. 2,500 years after it was written, CEOs and politicians and trial lawyers still keep copies on their desks because the core insight of the book has never been improved upon by anyone. That insight is deceptively simple. The supreme victory is not winning the battle. The supreme victory is making the battle unfold on terms your opponent never agreed to. Sun Tzu didn't write about courage. He didn't write about inspiration or honor or fighting spirit. He wrote about preparation, deception, manipulation of terrain, and the systematic exploitation of your opponent's assumptions about how the conflict is supposed to be conducted. He wrote, and this matters enormously for understanding Mourinho, that every battle is won before it is ever fought. To understand what Mourinho represents, you have to understand the orthodoxy he walked into. European football by the early 2000s had settled into a broad consensus about what great management looked like. You developed a philosophy. You built a system that expressed your ideas about how the game should be played. You recruited players who fit that system, and you imposed your identity on every match, regardless of the opponent. The great managers were artists. Wenger's Arsenal, Cruyff's Barcelona, Sacchi's Milan. Football management was increasingly understood as an act of creative expression, and the highest praise you could receive was that your team played beautiful football. Mourinho arrived at Chelsea in 2004 and told the assembled press that he was a special one. Then he went out and built something that looked nothing like art. Chelsea's back-to-back Premier League titles in 2005 and 2006 were constructed on a defensive foundation so solid that the numbers still look like database errors 20 years later. In the 2004 to 2005 season, Chelsea conceded 15 goals in 38 league matches. 15. That's fewer than one goal every 2 games across an entire Premier League campaign.
Villarreal looking far post, Drogba. Fantastic goal. Really well-worked goal from Chelsea.
They kept 25 clean sheets. They lost 1 match all season. The football wasn't always pretty. It wasn't supposed to be. Sun Tzu wrote that all warfare is based on deception. When you are able to attack, you must seem unable. When you are active, you should appear inactive. When you are near, make your enemy believe you are far away. Watch any Mourinho team at its peak, and you're watching that principle executed in real time on a football pitch. The low defensive block that invites pressure is not passivity. It's a trap. The willingness to surrender possession is not a lack of ambition. It's the deliberate creation of space that only becomes available when your opponent commits numbers forward. Every time a pundit called Mourinho's football negative or defensive or anti-football, they were making the same error that every general in history has made when they confuse their opponent's strategy with weakness. The Porto Champions League run in 2004 is where the template was established. Porto had no business winning that tournament. They were a Portuguese club with a fraction of the spending power of the teams they were drawn against. Their wage bill wouldn't have covered the bench of a squad like AC Milan or Real Madrid. They knocked out Manchester United in the round of 16 on a night where United dominated possession, created chances, and looked like the better team for significant stretches of both legs. They didn't care. They absorbed pressure, waited for the moment of structural vulnerability that Sun Tzu would have called the gap between intention and execution, and they punished it with the kind of clinical precision that only comes from a squad that has rehearsed exactly this scenario dozens of times on the training ground. Mourinho running down the Old Trafford touchline after Costinha's stoppage time goal wasn't just celebration. It was a statement that the old rules of engagement didn't apply anymore. Here's what Sun Tzu understood about conflict that the footballing establishment has spent 2 decades refusing to fully absorb. The general who wins a battle makes many calculations before the battle is fought. The general who loses makes few calculations beforehand. Mourinho's preparation is the aspect of his management that even his harshest critics cannot dismiss. The dossiers he compiled on opponents at Porto and Chelsea became legendary within the coaching community. Every set-piece routine cataloged, every defensive transition mapped, every individual tendency of every opposing player documented and distributed to his squad before the match. He didn't just know how opponents would play. He knew how they would react when their preferred patterns were disrupted, because he'd studied their fallback options as thoroughly as their primary ones. The 2010 Champions League campaign with Inter Milan is the purest expression of Mourinho as a Sun Tzu figure. He took a squad that was good but not transcendently talented and engineered a path through Chelsea, CSKA Moscow, and then Barcelona, the most dominant club side anyone had seen since Sacchi's Milan, culminating in a final against Bayern Munich that Inter won 2-0 with a performance of controlled, ruthless efficiency. The semifinal against Barcelona remains the tactical masterpiece that every defensive coach in the world has studied and most have tried to replicate. Mourinho identified that Guardiola's Barcelona, for all their possession dominance, had a specific vulnerability when opponents refused to press high and instead collapsed the central channels, while allowing circulation in wide areas where Barcelona's crosses were statistically least dangerous. He built Inter's entire 2-legged approach around that single insight. He told his players exactly where Barcelona would try to hurt them and exactly where Barcelona could be hurt in return. When Inter went down to 10 men in the second leg at the Camp Nou, the shape didn't collapse, it tightened. Because the system had been designed to function under pressure, not in spite of it, but because of it. Barcelona had more of the ball. Barcelona looked more like a team playing football. Barcelona went home. Sun Tzu described 5 dangerous faults that may affect a general. Recklessness, which leads to destruction. Cowardice, which leads to capture. A quick temper, which can be provoked. A sensitivity to honor, which can be manipulated. And an overconcern for his men, which exposes him to worry and trouble. Mourinho has weaponized at least 3 of these against his opponents throughout his career. The press conference mind games that consumed managers like Wenger and Villas-Boas were not personality defects. They were applications of a principle that Sun Tzu articulated 25 centuries before Mourinho sat in front of a microphone and called Wenger a voyeur and a specialist in failure. When you force your opponent to fight a battle in the press on Monday, you've already disrupted his preparation for the match on Saturday. Mourinho understood that the emotional bandwidth of a manager is finite. Every hour your rival spends formulating a response to something you said on television is an hour he didn't spend on his team's shape against your defensive block. The parallel extends to what happened when the establishment finally pushed back. Sun Tzu was not universally celebrated in his own time. The Art of War was a manual for pragmatists, and pragmatists have always made idealists uncomfortable. Mourinho experienced the same institutional resistance. Football's intelligentsia treated his success as something to be tolerated rather than admired, When Barcelona won their Champions League titles playing gorgeous attacking football, the narrative was about the beauty of the game. When Mourinho won his, the narrative was about whether he damaged the game in the process. The same sport that celebrated total football and tiki-taka as philosophical achievements dismissed Mourinho's defensive architecture as something lesser, something that worked but shouldn't be praised for working. This is exactly the dynamic Sun Tzu warned about. People confuse the method they prefer with the method that succeeds. Football wanted its great managers to be poets. Mourinho was an engineer, and the engineering worked at Porto, at Chelsea, at Inter Milan, and at points during his time at Real Madrid, where he went head-to-head with the greatest version of Barcelona we've ever seen and won a league title with 100 points. Now, the honest assessment requires examining the years where the framework stopped producing the same results. Mourinho's second spell at Chelsea ended in a dressing room revolt and a sacking with the champions hovering near the relegation zone. His time at Manchester United produced a Europa League and a second-place finish, but never felt like it was building toward sustained dominance. Tottenham hired him to win a trophy and fired him 6 days before a cup final. Roma felt like a strange exile. Sun Tzu himself would have anticipated this. He wrote that water shapes its course according to the nature of the ground over which it flows. The military strategist works out his victory in relation to the opponent he is facing. The implication is that rigidity, even rigidity in the application of correct principles, eventually becomes its own form of vulnerability. Mourinho's methods required a very specific type of player and a very specific type of institutional patience. When the players stopped buying in or the club's hierarchy demanded a different aesthetic, the framework collapsed, not because it was wrong, but because it required conditions that were no longer present. But this is exactly what separates Mourinho's legacy from his reputation. Reputation is how the football media has chosen to frame his last decade. Legacy is what the record actually contains. 2 Champions League titles with 2 different clubs, neither of which were favorites to win the competition. 3 Premier League titles, 8 other domestic league championships across 4 countries. A treble at Inter Milan that has never been repeated by any Italian club since. A Europa Conference League with Roma that had grown men in the streets of the Italian capital weeping because they hadn't won a European trophy in over 60 years. 26 trophies across his career as of today. You can dislike the method, you can wish the football looked different, but you cannot argue with 26 trophies spread across 4 different leagues and 3 European competitions. The record doesn't care about your aesthetic preferences. Sun Tzu closed The Art of War with a chapter on the use of intelligence, on knowing what others do not, on understanding that the decisive advantage in any conflict is not strength or courage or talent, it's information, applied ruthlessly and without sentiment. José Mourinho built his entire career on that chapter. Every dossier, every press conference, every defensive block that absorbed 90 minutes of pressure before releasing a single devastating counterattack. Every result that the football world looked at and said shouldn't have happened. They kept saying it shouldn't work. He kept proving that it did. And 2,500 years before he ever sat in a dugout, a Chinese strategist sitting in a room with ink and bamboo strips already knew exactly why.